promised Donna an introduction, of course, but a brief introduction so we can allow her as much time to speak to us as possible. One thing I'm going to urge you to do, if you haven't done it, is click on the link that Greg provided in the newsletter. You know, there was a blurb about this presentation, this lunch colloquium, in the most recent newsletter last Monday, and some information about Donna's, shall we say, storied history as a statistician and as a woman statistician in particular. But there was a link to an article she herself recently wrote for Chance magazine that's called Challenging Sex Discrimination, Reflections Over 7 Decades. It's a wonderful article. You have got to go there. I mean, it's our time, right? Those are our 7 decades. And God knows the women in this room know what she's talking about, and I think most of the men know what she's talking about, too. It's just a wonderfully written piece, says the English teacher. And
thank you.
And just full of wonderful story material. Again, very familiar story material. There are lots of photographs, too, by the way, from 40 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago. And you know what? She looks the same today as she did back then. I think there must be an oil portrait in a closet somewhere that is in terrible condition. Because look at her now. How do you explain that? Dorian Gray. Okay, basic information, BA from Gettysburg, a master's from Purdue, a PhD from Iowa, Iowa State. Gotta keep these things straight. And then 4 years at Chapel Hill, again, as one of few women in her field, and charged in that case with setting up their public health program, and of course doing biostatistics. But in '71, she came to Emory, which had an even more fledgling program in the School of Medicine at that point. She was one, as you might imagine, of very few women in the School of Medicine. One of the first four women to finally be promoted to full professor in that school. And when the program, the biometrics program, moved over to School of Public Health and became Rollins School of Public Health, she went with it, acted as department chair in biometry there for 3 years. Yes, one of the stories I really enjoyed, she did that for 3 years and then realized she really wanted to spend more time doing the work of biometry, of biostatistics. And so she resigned as department chair. And her dean turned to her and, offering this comment as a compliment, said, you have, let me get it right. Said, Donna, you are the only department chair in the school with balls. And as Donna wrote in this article, I took his comment as a compliment, but wondered why he needed to resort to male anatomy for his assessment of my term as chair. Ladies, I think many of us have been there, have we not? Commended or challenged for our balls. It reminded me of Mary Tyler Moore, actually. I caught an episode over the weekend, the old episode, where she goes in to complain to her boss about being paid less than a man in her same position. And Lou Grant, the boss, says to her, Mary, you have spunk. And Mary says, well. And Lou Grant says, I hate spunk. Anyway, just again, a wonderful contribution here in the School of Public Health. and nationwide and outside the confines of the nation too, offering courses, much needed coursework in biostatistics and sample survey, just all over in institutions of higher education, for government people, community people, just all over the place. And retired in 2004, except clearly not retired, so clearly not retired. And again, I don't want to go on at too great length. I will tell one little story further from that wonderful article I encourage you to link to and read. It pops right up. She did win the Thomas Jefferson Award here in '93. By '93, well, let's say by '91, the Thomas Jefferson Award had been in place for almost 30 years. 29 men in succession had been named as recipients of the Thomas Jefferson Award. The year before Donna was chosen, a woman was chosen for the first time to receive the Thomas Jefferson Award. And then in the next year, '93, Donna was chosen to receive the Thomas Jefferson Award. And then the committee met. The most recent recipient chairs the committee to choose the next recipient. And the committee met, and one of the men on the committee said, well, we've had 2 women in a row, so let's not even consider any of the women on this issue. And as Donna reports, she said in all innocence, right, she said, well, has there ever been a time when 2 men or more in a row have been chosen? Wonderful. Anyway, I think you're going to see wonderful. And I will turn it over to Donna. She promises plenty of time for comments and questions at the end. And she promises to stay past 1 o'clock if any of you want to come forward once we close up and talk to her then. So enjoy.
Okay, Gretchen, or Gray. Gray showed me how to put this on, but I can't figure it out now. Technologically challenged.
I'm an English teacher. Not said.
Thank you, Gray. Okay.
And we'll be sure it's loud enough to. Holly can holler from the back if it's not okay.
Okay, so the microphone sounds like it's on. All right. So for those of you who can figure out who the dean was at the School of Public Health when I resigned as chair, it wasn't the dean who said that. So I feel I just have to make that correction. It was an administrator, a male administrator, in the dean's office. Okay, all right, so I didn't really want to say who it was, but it wasn't the dean. And at the time, Ray Greenberg was the dean, but he's not the one who gave me that comment. Okay. All right, so as Gretchen said, I'm a sample survey statistician, and I was intrigued by the apparent disconnect between the pre-election polls and predictions and the actual outcome of the election last November. And I was very interested in reading this recent report published about 2 months ago by AAPOR, that's the American Association for Political Opinion Research. And I found it quite informative. I've also looked a lot at Nate Silver's website, 538.com, and I've sort of read some other stuff. Now, one disclaimer for this talk is I'm not a political scientist, okay? And I haven't really worked in the political science arena as a statistician. I've mainly worked in medicine and public health and social science. Some people would call political science a social science, but I haven't worked in that particular one. So if I say anything wrong about political science, please forgive me. If you want to correct it, you can make a comment, etc. Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is this. I'm going to try to explain how political polls use survey methodology to do two things: measure public opinion and measure voter preference. A couple people in the Emeritus College who knew I was going to give this seminar said to me, how are people selected to these polls? How do they do that? So I'm going to try to answer that question. Then I'm going to talk about people, and basically what they do is they use public polls and they use the results from a lot of public polls to try to predict who is going to be elected president. So they're using state polls because they're trying to predict where the electoral votes are going to fall, etc. And this activity, predicting who the future president will be, and they also have to, of course, guess at who's going to go to the polls, what demographic groups are so again, Nate Silver is one of the persons who does that along with other people, other websites. And then I'm going to summarize the AAPOR report, what their findings were. So that's where I'm headed. All right. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is target populations and population parameters of interest to pollsters. So all those words in yellow are sample survey terminology. You may have never heard the terms. So I'm going to try to define them by way of example. Okay, so if you're a pollster, you're conducting polls for the upcoming election, or any kind, opinion polls, here are two national target populations you're going to be interested in finding something out about. The first one is basically adults who live in the United States in a housing unit, so they're not institutionalized like living in a prison. And there are about 250 million of these adults in the country right now. Pretty much they're asking these adults, they want to know what the public opinion is of Americans. So lots of times when you read results, it says, 80% of Americans think that. Okay, so they're making inference to this first target population. And one of the things that's going on now, there are a lot of polls in the newspaper about the presidential approval rate. So the question that's asked goes something like this. In general, would you approve or disapprove of the job that President Trump is doing? And then if you say, I approve, then they say, well, do you strongly approve or somewhat approve? So they're trying to get approval, disapproval on a 5-point scale, going from strongly disapprove to strongly approve. Usually when the results are presented, it's percent approve, percent disapprove. I mean, for a headline, you don't want to report 5 percentages that add up to 100%. Okay, but lots of times when you look at these polls online, you can get a breakout of the percentage who strongly approve, strongly disapprove, etc. Okay, so lots of public opinion. What do you think about the health care bill that's being proposed in the Senate? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so those are public opinion polls. Now the next target population that lots of pollsters are interested in, these happen shortly or maybe a long time before an election coming up. And so the target population is registered voters. Okay. And these registered voters, when they come into the sample, they may be asked their opinion about something, but most certainly they're going to be asked a question like this. If the election were held today, for whom among these candidates would you vote? All right. Okay, so those are two national target populations that definitely are of interest to pollsters. Pollsters are also interested in those same two target populations, but on a statewide basis, not the whole country, statewide. So the target population of adults or of registered voters within a given state. Pollsters who are trying to figure out the electoral college votes, just in people. Pollsters who are trying to figure out the electoral college votes that's going to happen in the future, of course, are interested in statewide polls. Or sometimes you do polling in a congressional district. Okay, so there were some polls done in the 6th congressional district before the recent runoff race between Handel and Ossoff. Okay. Now, state polls for the 2016 election were not done in every single state because it's a waste of time, basically. Nobody was uncertain of how California was going to vote, right? Okay. All right. So only state polls for the 2016 election were only done within states that were battleground states, swing states, states in play, etc., sort of the uncertain states. And I tried to sort of find out how many of them were there, so I read several sources. It seems that it sort of ranges from maybe 11 to 16 states, depending on whose list you're reading. Was there a question or comment back there?
Yes, so is it only one adult per household in the school?
You will get an answer to that question in about 2 or 3 slides. I did not plant this question in the audience. Okay. Now, in addition to those 2 target populations, household adults or registered voters, the people who do aggregation of political polls, or they make predictions about who's going to be the future president. Sometimes they're called prognosticators. They're sort of guessing or trying to figure out what's going to happen in the future. So the aggregators will collect and summarize a lot of polls that are being done. Again, Nate Silver does this on his website, plus other websites. And then beyond just collecting polls that have been done by lots of other people and summarizing them, then other people, the prognosticators, they use the poll results and from registered voters, and then they try to figure out who's going to be elected president. So they have in mind a target population, either national or state, depending on what they're doing. They have in mind a target population, which they call likely voters. Okay? Because if you think about it, these people are making their predictions in September and October, and the target population of interest, the people who actually vote on November 8th, or perhaps early voting a little before, that population is not in existence yet when these predictions are being made. So the people who figure out these probabilities, oh, Clinton will win the presidency with probability 0.98 or whatever, you know, they're making a lot of guesses. They're doing a lot of statistical modeling. I mean, it's a very, I've never done it. So, so I know a little bit about what they're doing. It seems very interesting. It is a lot of guesswork, and there are many opportunities in all of this guesswork to be wrong. Okay, all right. Now, one of the reasons that sample survey people, professionals, are very interested in election polls and stuff like that is because I think it is the only situation where you can, you know, estimate what % of registered voters in the target population would vote for Clinton today, et cetera. You can do all these polls. And then eventually, after the election is over, you actually know the value of the population parameter that you were trying to estimate before the election was held. So you sort of know, in effect, the truth. And this doesn't happen in regular sample surveys. Like, you know, health surveys are done all the time. They try to estimate how many adults in the country have hypertension, what's the prevalence of hypertension among adults who live in the country. Those are all estimates. Nobody ever knows the truth, the true value of those population parameters, because you're never going to measure 250 million adults to find out whether each adult has hypertension or not. So this polling business, as I say, is of high interest to a lot of sample survey methodologists, because at the end of it all, you know the truth. Now, it's not actually that clear cut, because when you do the poll before the election, if the election were held that day, you might be able But then, if there's a time span between when you do the poll and the election happens, lots of disastrous consequences can occur in that time period, and maybe will change the mind of the voter who originally said, I'm going to vote for X, and now that voter is going to vote for Y. Okay, so being a prognosticator in the political poll is a risky situation. It's probably a little bit too risky for me.
Yeah.
Okay. So the first thing I'm going to talk about now is how are these public opinion polls conducted? So how might you be selected to be a person in these polls? And I'm going to talk about two target populations at once: household adults, about 250 million, and then registered voters, about 200 million. So have any of you been selected to be in a political poll? Okay, a couple. Did you actually participate and provide answers? You don't have to answer. Okay. All right. Okay.
May I come in on this? One of the things that's happened now is that the number of phony polls far exceeds the number of real polls.
Yes.
And anybody who was in the 6th congressional district knows that, because you were getting a phony poll every 20 minutes.
All right.
And the trick was to figure out what the real polls were, because you could at least answer those. But the phony polls you had to hang up on.
Right. So I don't know if you all heard him, but he's talking about phony polls. Or I know I had a friend who told me that she was called for a political poll, and I said, really? And she said, yes. And I said, did they ask you for money? And she said, yes. I said, no legitimate sample survey poll or political poll will ever ask you for money. That is a fundraising call. That is not a legitimate survey call. Okay, so you have to be careful. All right. So if you want to choose a sample from either one of these two target populations to ask opinion questions, or for whom are you going to, unregistered voters, for whom are you going to vote, everybody uses what's called dual frame random digit dialing, sometimes abbreviated as DFRDD.
Yeah.
Okay, so random digit dialing was a technique that started in 1985 for getting a sample of people from these two target populations I'm talking about right now. And of course, they were only calling landline telephone numbers in 1985, because I'm not even sure anybody had a cell phone in 1985. I certainly didn't. Nowadays, though, that will not work. An estimated 50% of all household adults in this country are what we call cell only. That is, the only way you can reach them on the telephone is to call their cell phone, because they don't have a landline telephone in the housing unit where they live. Okay, so if you read any poll that samples only landline numbers, don't read any further, don't waste your time. Okay. So there are two sampling frames, and each sampling frame contains all possible landline numbers, that's one frame, and all possible cell phone numbers, that's the second frame. So if you think about it, it's pretty easy to construct this. So the first thing is you list all area codes in the country if you're doing a national poll. So one area code is 404. We all know that area code. All right. Then for each area code, 404, you identify the prefixes. That's the next three numbers in your telephone number. You identify the prefixes that have been set aside by the telephone company for landline telephone numbers. So 378 is a prefix within 404 for landline telephone numbers. Then you take the, let's see, what is this? Okay. Then you take this 6-digit telephone number here, and you generate all possible telephone numbers, which will go from 000 up to 9999. So there are 10,000 of them. Okay, so this one combination of one area code with a landline prefix will generate 10,000 telephone numbers on the landline frame. Then you move to the next prefix. 373 is another prefix within 404 that goes to a landline, etc. So then you do that in every state all over the country. You get millions and millions of telephone numbers on the landline sampling frame. Okay, then you start on the cell phone. So you go back to area code 40. Oops. Oh, sorry. Okay. All right.
There you go.
Thanks. So you go back to the area code 404. This is a cell phone prefix, and then you do the same thing. You generate 10,000 telephone numbers with this particular combination, and those 10,000 numbers go on to the sampling frame for cell phone telephone numbers. So that's how this is generated. I tried to do a little calculation to see how many telephone numbers were on these two sampling frames. It's a little hard, but the rough number I came up with is about 900 million. It's a lot of telephone numbers. Okay. All right. Now, once you have these two sampling frames, then what happens is a probability sample is selected from the phone numbers from each sampling frame. And notice I have probability sample in bold. That's because it's a certain type of sampling, and I'm only going to talk about probability samples today. And to be a probability sample, every phone number on the sampling frames, every phone number needs to have some chance of coming into the sample. And not only that, somebody has to know what that probability is. Now, who would know that? The person who's designing the sampling plan, namely the sample survey statistician or somebody else who wouldn't necessarily call themselves that but knows how to do this. So that's the definition of a probability sample. And so basically you have to know with what probability each person you eventually contact was selected. And that way, if you know that, then you can make statistical inference back to the target population and estimate the population parameters of interest to you. So once you select a whole lot of telephone numbers to be in the sample, then you start calling the telephone numbers. Now, yes?
At that point, are you weeding out things like the block of 1,000 numbers that go to AT&T, or the block of 1,000 numbers that goes to Riches, or the block of 1,000 numbers that goes to
all right,
to the Attorney General's office?
Okay, so he's asking, do you really use a sampling frame as you described, Donna, because it's not very efficient? And no, I didn't go into that detail. There is some weeding out of telephone numbers on the sampling frame before you select the probability sample. Different people do this different ways. But basically, they are trying to weed out from the sampling frame telephone numbers that go to businesses or telephone numbers, that go to other places. Examples of what you mentioned. So some of that goes on. All right. So now as I said, now what happens is you start calling all the telephone numbers that have come into the sample. Now, many phone numbers that you call actually don't go to a person in the target population. So some examples are, this number has never been assigned to anybody. This number is disconnected. It actually goes to a business. It goes to a cell phone, but it's a kid who's 10 years old. You're not going to ask the kid for their opinion about this, that, and the other. Okay, all right. Some other things that might happen at the other end of the telephone number when you call is there's always no answer. No matter how many days you call or how many times you call, nobody ever answers the phone. Okay. Probably because they're screening their calls or if they ever look at their phone. Okay. Another one is ring busy. It rings busy all the time you call, so you don't know what's on the other end. Now, these kind of outcomes sort of count against the survey response rate, because if you get no answer and ring busy, you don't really know if there's a person in the target population that you're interested in who's at the other end of that telephone line. Okay, so what happens now if somebody answers their landline phone? So this was the question that was asked in the back of the room. All right, so if you call a number, it's a landline, and somebody answers the phone, the job of the interviewer is to talk to any adult in that household to ask a screening question. The screening question is, how many adults live in your household? If the answer is 1, you're probably talking to that adult, because you're supposed to ask the screening question to any adult in the household. And so then the interviewer says, great, would you like to be interviewed? We'd very much like to interview you. So if you live in a single adult household and you get called on your landline, you're the person who's going to be interviewed. If there are 2 or 3 or more adults living in your household, the interviewer says, how many adults live in your household? I don't need to know their names, I just need to know the number. So if the answer is 2 or 3, then one of the adults in the household is randomly chosen to be the adult to be interviewed. This is under the control of the sample survey statistician. It's not the person on the phone saying, well, I'll be interviewed, I love to answer surveys. That's a big no-no. All right. Now, if the telephone number that you're calling goes to a cell phone and it's an adult, what pollsters are assuming is that a cell phone is sort of a personal phone for the adult. There aren't, 4 people using one cell phone number. That might happen, but it's quite rare. Okay, so if you answer the phone, if you answer your cell phone, and it's a public opinion poll calling, etc., they want to interview you, the person who is the owner of the cell phone who's using the cell phone. Typically, a common sample size is 1,000 completed interviews. The pollsters have sort of latched on to that, and they believe, that this is good. It's an okay guideline, according to Donna. Okay. But to get 1,000 completed interviews, they have to select into the sample about 40,000 phone numbers and call 40,000 phone numbers. So you make 40 phone calls, you get 1 completed interview. It's a lot of work to do this. Okay. Now, another very telling characteristic of using DFRDD for political polls is the survey response rates are very low. It's in caps and it's in bold. I should have also put it into italics. Okay, the response rates are very low. Now, none of the people who do these polls or the organizations will ever tell you what their survey response is. Believe me, I have read thousands of footnotes, for polls that have been done. I'm either reading on the web or, the Washington Post or the New York Times or whatever. I have never, ever seen a survey response rate posted. But what the AAPOR report says, and remember, who's on this committee? A lot of people on the committee are the people doing these polls. Okay, so in the report, they've actually put in print that the response rates for these kind of polls are now in the single digits. What does that mean? It means the maximum response rate is 9%. Okay, and when I was in graduate school, thinking about taking courses in surveys, everybody was trying for a 94% response. Okay, so there are lots of reasons why this has happened in the United States. That's another story. Okay, but it is a very low response rate. Now, there are other surveys done in the United States besides political polls that use this DFRDD. So one of these surveys is BRFSS. It's a health survey. Each state does the health survey, behavioral risk factor surveillance system. And I looked at their data for 2015. So out of the 51 surveys that were done, one survey per state plus Washington, D.C., the median overall survey response rate was around 45%. Okay, so 45% we used to think is not great. But so there's a big difference between this particular other DFRDD survey and the political polls. I think the main reason for the difference is that the political polls are in the field for a much shorter period of time. They're mainly done by news organizations, either newspapers or TV stations, et cetera, et cetera. BRFSS, if you're selected in that survey, they try for a month to contact you. And then after a month, they give up. If you read in the footnote to these political polls, data were collected, 4 days. So they get in there, they get the results because they want to publish the news. If they're asking somebody's opinion about something or about a particular event, they don't want to field a survey and then report reaction or public opinion to that event where the event happened 6 weeks ago because we all forgot it happened. That's not news. Okay. So they have a very different orientation. Yes.
So is it such a low response rate necessarily going to skew the results?
Next slide. Okay. She asked, do the low response rates skew the results? The answer is maybe. Yes.
9% of what? Is it 9% of the people who answer?
Yeah, okay.
Or is it 9% of the random?
All right. Okay. All right. So how do they calculate this 9%? AAPOR has a very good document, which is about 100 pages long, about how to calculate the response rate for your survey. So there are lots of different ways to do it. But basically, it's a function of the contact rate. In other words, when you call a phone number, some phone numbers, what happened to them. They're disconnected. They're not going to go to a person in the target population. Or it's never been assigned. They're not going to go to a person in the target population. Those outcomes, when you call, do not make your response rate lower. Other outcomes, ring no answer, busy, those kind of outcomes do count against your response rate because there might be a person in the target population if somebody could ever answer the phone there, all right? So it counts against your response rate. And then there are other areas, there are other opportunities for non-response to occur. You call a number, it's a landline. You ask to speak to an adult. No adult ever comes to the phone. It's some kid. Hi, whatever. And you say, can you get your mommy or your daddy to come to the phone? But the kid wants to talk. Okay, all right. Okay. So you can never get an adult to the phone to ask how many adults are in the house. So that counts against you. Or you get an adult and you say how many adults live in your housing unit, and they say it's none of your business, and they hang up. All right. Or if you get past that, you select a person to interview, and it's not the adult you're talking to who answered the question about 3 adults in the housing unit, and you can never get in touch with that person. That counts against you. So there are lots of opportunities for non-response in this whole process. And so you sort of multiply all this together and you come up with maybe 0.09 at best. Yes? yes. So, so if you call somebody on a cell phone, it's an adult, you want to interview that person. And so you say directly, we'd like to interview you, will you cooperate? And they hang up on you. Or they may berate you for a while before they hang up. All right. Okay. So, you know, I mean, if you get to the point of asking a person who's in the target population, will you agree to be interviewed? That means you've already got over a fair number of hurdles, okay? All right, but yes, you can get refusal at that point. Yes? Did you have a question?
Donna,
Oh, Jim, okay.
Robot calls. In other words, does the interviewer use a robot to sort of get in there, and then a person actually comes on later on?
Okay, so he was asking about robocalls. Sometimes that's done. I think this is called IVR surveys, interactive voice something recognition maybe or something. The polls that I'm talking about typically are live interviewers, okay, not dead robots. But yes, some of these polls, some of them are set up that way. And then, yes, eventually you can be transferred to a live interview. Yes?
It seems to me that landline sample and cell phone sample are two very different populations. Because older people like me tend to like a landline.
I do too. How many people love their landline? Look at that. Okay.
Younger people don't even have a landline.
Absolutely. My daughter, who's here, has no landline. She hasn't for years. She lives down the street. I have to call a long-distance number to talk to her on the phone. So what's your question? Sorry, I cut you off. Is that it?
No, yeah. I mean,
Okay,
so
right.
doesn't that
Okay,
skew the-
so, that's awesome.
I just thought I would say, you may find, as several of you have found, that Donna will be getting to answers to your questions as she moves along. She's promised to save 15, 20 minutes at the end for comments and questions. So if you feel you've got to chime in now, Jan, please do. Otherwise, I think if you wait a little bit, you may find your question answered anyway.
But I will make a comment. It's one of my speaker notes on one of my slides with respect to your comment. About 70, an estimated 70% of adults, the household adults in this country, are either what we call cell only, they have no landline at home, or cell mostly, which means they use a cell phone for 85% or more of their calls. They have a landline at home. They don't use it very much. Okay. So what these polls try to do is, among 1,000 people who are going to have completed interviews at the end, they try to make sure that about 70% of the completed interviews are conducted on the cell phone, and about 30% of the completed interviews are conducted on the landline phone. So they try to balance it that way because indeed they are very different populations. There's no question about it. Okay. All right. Okay, now, do low survey response rates result in biased point estimates? Now, the word bias, for those of you who are not in statistics or math or whatever, okay, a biased point estimate is you do the calculations based on the sample and you estimate what percentage of the household adult population approve of the job that Trump is doing, etc. But if there are things wrong somewhere are, like a low response rate, etc., it could result in a biased point estimate. So that means that the calculation you get is either going to be too low compared to the true value of the population parameter, or too high, and it's consistently off. Okay, and so does that happen if you have a really low response rate for these political polls? So the quick answer is not necessarily. And then the second bullet there is sort of the technical lingo. So if you use an unadjusted estimator of the population parameter, it's going to be biased if there's a correlation between two things. One thing is the likelihood of a person to respond to a survey if asked. Lots of times they don't use the word likelihood, they call it propensity. But it's just, the idea is that everybody has their own personal probability of how likely they are to respond to a survey if they are asked. Remember, I'm not talking about any surveys where people volunteer to be in the sample. Okay. I don't even read those polls. Okay. All right. But if asked, so you have some probability of responding. So if your propensity to respond is related to the answer you give to the primary question, then that gives a potential for biased estimators. So what I'm going to do right now on the third bullet, I'm going to skip ahead really to the AAPOR report, because this happened in 2016. And so I'm going to try to give a concrete example with bullet 3 of what I'm talking about in technical lingo in bullet 2. Okay, so think about 2016 polls of registered voters. And so one of the questions you're asked, if the election were held today, for whom would you vote? Okay, and so what happens is, what happened in 2016 is that people who are college plus educated, all right, are actually more likely to participate in the political polls done in 2016. And in fact, they're probably more likely to participate in all kinds of surveys, okay? But then what happened in this election is that college plus adults are also more likely to vote for Clinton. All right, so can you see what's happening here? You call somebody. A person who's not college plus educated has a much higher probability of saying, I'm not going to talk to you, clunk. So what happens is you end up with an overrepresentation of college plus people in your sample. Not because you did anything wrong, it's just a function of, you know, who responds and who doesn't to the invitation. All right. And then, so you have an overrepresentation of these people who then also are more likely to vote for Clinton. All right. And so this is one of the reasons it's discussed in the AAPO report about why polls sort of consistently underestimated support for Trump or overestimated support for Clinton. Okay, because a lot of the polls did not adjust for education. Now, what's this adjustment process? Okay, so everybody who does polls, not just political polls, health surveys, anything, the response rates are going down. None of the other polls I look at, are down in single digits. Okay, but so there's a way to adjust for non-response. For example, it's well known that women are more likely to participate in polls than men. It's not a dramatic difference, but it's a very consistent difference. Also, age, older people are more likely to participate than younger people, et cetera. So there are a lot of characteristics that we all, in the survey world, we all know about. So once we get a sample of 1,000 completed interviews, what we do is we do some calculations to pull that sample into line with census data. See, now we have external data, which we think is the truth. That comes from the census. For example, the census will tell you, the percentage of the adult household populations that female is whatever it is, 52 or 53%, and the percent that male is whatever. The census will tell you what percentage are older, blah, blah, blah. So we consider that to be the truth. And so then we differentially weight or give emphasis to people in the sample, so that when we use the sample to estimate what percentage of adults in the U.S. are female, we get the same answer as the external census data. Okay? This, you might think this is cheating, but it's standard survey methodology, and we've been doing it since the beginning of sample surveys in this country using probability sampling, which was sometime in the early 30s. The first probability sample survey done in the United States was to try to estimate unemployment rate in the height of the Great Depression. All right. Okay, so this is what is done, and what happened. One of the things that happened in 2016, I says everybody adjusts for age, sex, and race, ethnicity, the three favorite demographic characteristics. They may adjust for other things. Do you live in an urban or rural area, or whatever? But very few, not very many polls in the 2016 season adjusted for education. And see, this is the issue. Am I on that slide yet? No. Okay. All right. One of the things the AAPOR committee did is they looked at hundreds. They had data sets for hundreds of election polls conducted in the election season, and they actually analyzed. They did a ton of work. I mean, they really did. I was quite impressed. So one of the things they did is they had hundreds of these polls, and based on the polls that they looked at, what they found was about 50% of the national polls did adjust for education in this non-response adjustment, and about 30% of state polls did adjust for education, okay, which means that 70% of the state polls that they had in their collection did not adjust for education. All right. Now, in addition to potential biased estimators from a very low response rate, you have to remember that any point estimate that you calculate has what we call sampling error. I don't like this word, sampling error. I never liked it from my early days as a graduate student in statistics, because it implies you're doing something wrong. And so I prefer the word sampling variability. Okay. But whatever you call it, I tried to get my discipline to change, but they're not going to listen to some young upstart. I mean, I had this idea when I was still in my 20s, okay? Okay, so each point estimate has sampling error. Now, one of the things about probability sampling is you can actually estimate what the sampling error is for your point estimate, all right? And the way that all political polls report this measure of uncertainty is called margin of error, sometimes abbreviated as MOE. It's really margin of sampling error. And it's 1/2 the width of the 95% confidence interval on the population parameter. And if you haven't had a stat course, that is meaningless to you, but it will be illustrated on the next slide. All right, so if you start reading the footnotes, in the reading material where you read about these polls. A common thing that's done among political pollsters is once you get around 1,000 completed interviews, for any percentage that you are calculating and reporting, that reported percentage has a margin of error of 3%, or some polls use 3.5% as the margin of error. Some polls use 4%. I don't like 3%. It's too conservative. It's not high enough. It doesn't recognize you're always doing a weighted analysis, and that contributes to more sampling variability in your point estimate. So I like 3.5 or 4 better than 3. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a poll that was in the news last week. Maybe some of you read it, about presidential approval. Okay, so 2 polls were done recently, one in July. This is still July. See, they fielded the poll in July. They did all of this waiting. They made all the phone calls. They analyzed the data, and it was in the newspaper last week, and it's not even the end of July yet. These people move fast. If they want a slower paced life, they should move to the academic world. Okay. All right. I mean, it's a whole different operation and mentality, I think. Not that one is good and the other is bad, it's just really different. Okay, so this poll, okay, 2 time points, April and July, and they're asking about, do you approve of the job that the president is doing in general? Sponsored by the Washington Post and the ABC News. Act Associates was a research firm that cooperated on this. They are well known for their expertise in sample survey methodology. Target population, U.S. household adults, there's 250 million people. They use DFRDD. They state their margin of error for all percentages that they calculate as 3.5%. Donna likes that. She doesn't like 3%. Not that they care a whit. Okay. So now here is, do any of you remember reading this poll?
Yeah.
So what's the headline? Do you remember the headline? Presidential approval rating drops. Okay, so now we're going to look at this. Now I'm going to teach you how to read these articles wherever you're reading them, on the web, the newspaper, okay? All right. Okay, so in April, an estimated 42% of the 250 million household adults in the country, and notice I keep saying an estimated 42% of the 250 million adults in the country. So I'm reminding you, this is an estimate, this isn't truth. This is a point estimate from a sample, it's not truth. And I'm reminding you what the target population is that I'm talking about. All right. So an estimated 42% approve of the job that Trump is doing in April, and an estimated 36% different poll. These 2 polls are statistically independent, people, different telephone numbers selected, everything. So now it's gone down 36%. And the headline is something like this: Trump's approval rating drops. All right. So now, but what you can do is you can use the margin of error, which is actually reported, to sort of figure out, well, how much variability is there in this 42%? So you take 42% plus or minus the margin of error, 3.5. So 42 plus 3.5, hey, it's 45.5, that's the upper limit, and this is the lower limit. Now you do the same thing for this point estimate, 36%. Plus 3% is 39.5 minus 3%. So now you have 2 confidence limits. Now, or confidence intervals. Now, what does this confidence interval mean? Okay, I'm not going to explain this in absolutely correct statistical lingo, but just sort of, basically you can sort of think it's very likely that the true value of the population parameter is sort of captured in this range of numbers. Not with 100%, but you can, in other words, you can sort of operate as though the true value is in this interval. Likewise here. Now, do you notice that these 2 confidence intervals overlap? All right, so they overlap. All right. Now, so I'm going to draw my conclusion by looking at this and saying, hey, these confidence intervals overlap. Now, if there are any statisticians in the crowd, I know you're thinking, oh my God, I can't believe that Donna is doing this. Because statisticians typically would not decide whether these 2-point estimates are statistically significantly different from each other. They wouldn't use a procedure of looking at overlapping confidence intervals. We do a somewhat different test. But looking at confidence limits and seeing if they overlap is a quick and easy thing you can do. It will be right a large percentage of the time. And so some of the times it's not going to give you the right answer. But you can do this as you're reading the newspaper or the website. You can do it in your head. All right, so my conclusion here would be these 2 point estimates. They both have sampling variability. And it is entirely plausible, and I choose to believe that the approval, the real value of the approval rating in April is not any different from the real value of the approval rating in July. These two numbers are not really different enough to cause me to discard that belief. All right? So I disagree with the headline, and I just gave my own interpretation. Don't believe everything you read. Okay. All right. I don't think I'm going to show this video. All right. So now, so that was an example of a poll done on household adults to get public opinion. Now, what are polls that are done for where the target population is registered voters? Basically, and it's a national poll. Basically, they will use dual frame RDD. They get a sample of household adults, like I just described. Then once the adult comes into the sample and is agreeing to answer questions, you say, are you a registered voter? They say yes or no. So now all the people who say yes, you now have a probability sample of registered voters from the target population of, I think it's 200 million registered voters. And so here's the question you're going to ask them if the election were held today, for whom would you vote, et cetera. Now, one of the things that happens when you ask this question among registered voters is some people are not going to choose one of the candidates who are running. In 2016, there were 4 candidates. All right, so, and what they say is, well, I haven't decided yet, or I really don't know for whom I'm going to vote. And if you looked at the political polls sort of leading up to the election, it looked to me, remember I'm not a political scientist, but it looked to me like there was a large percentage of people who were saying don't know or I haven't decided yet. It was around 10 or 11 or 12%. It varied depending on what state you looked at. But to me, that's sort of large, especially if you're only 2 or 3 weeks out from the election. And if you are the prognosticator using these polls to try to figure out what's the probability of a Clinton win, you have to decide what you're going to do with the people who answer don't know here or undecided. Are you going to think that they distribute themselves as the people who did give a real answer? Are you going to ignore them, etc.? Different strategies there will result in different probabilities that these people calculate. So now here's a poll example for registered voters. And I made up these numbers because I couldn't quickly find one. So, but they're in the ballpark. So, dual frame random digit dialing, 1,680 completed interviews. And out of those 1,680, 1,008 say, I'm a registered voter. So now you have a sample size of 1,000, more or less 1,000, from the target population of registered voters. And I'm going to use margin of error for all the point estimates to be 3% because the arithmetic is a little easier. Okay, all right. So the percentage who said if the election were held today, Trump 43%, Clinton 47%. Notice these don't add up to 100%. They add up to 90% because 10%, an estimated 10% of the target population registered voters is saying I haven't decided yet. Now, one of the ways that they summarize the polls in the news a lot is looking at the point spread. Okay, so the point spread here, percent Clinton minus percent Trump is 4%. So Clinton is up 4 points, etc. So this is reported very different ways. So the headline could be Clinton leading Trump by 4 points! Exclamation mark. Maybe 2. Okay. So what does Donna do? She constructs the 95% confidence interval. Okay. So the point estimate for Trump is 43%. Margin of error 3%. So it's 43% plus or minus 3%. 40 to 46. Clinton is 47 plus or minus 3. 44 to 50. these confidence limits overlap. Is that my phone? I don't think so. Okay. Anyway, so they overlap. And so Donna's conclusion is, even though say, oh, Clinton is up by 4 points, so I decide, look, this could happen if the same percentage of people are voting for Trump as voting for Clinton. I'm not going to get excited by the fact that Clinton is up 4 points. Now, if the sample size, instead of 1,000 registered voters, was 20,000 registered voters, that is a different story. Because with 20,000 registered voters, the margin of error is a lot smaller than 3%. Really a lot smaller. Okay, so sample size is one of the most important drivers of what the margin of error turns out to be. So the smaller your sample size, the wider the confidence limits are going to be. All right. Now, skipping ahead again to the AAPOR report, they are critical of people, namely these are journalists doing this, not to pick on anybody in particular, but the people who are reporting the results of the poll. All right. So since this is used all the time leading up to the election, this point spread thing, what the AAPOR report said, look, you should report the margin of error for the point spread. All right? Rather than doing this, what Donna suggested, getting two confidence intervals, seeing if they overlap, etc. Just give the margin of error for the point spread. It's easily calculated if you have the data set. I could not calculate the point spread given the data I had from the newspaper that I was reading, etc. But what I did was I estimated a lower bound on what the margin error would be. It's probably bigger than this. The lower bound I got was 4%. So at best, the margin of error for this is 4%, and it's likely bigger than 4%, which then, of course, is going to include 0, right? Just, you know, nobody is leading over anybody else. Now, the other national target population that people are interested in is the likely voters. Remember, this is a target population that doesn't exist yet when you're doing a survey. So how do you get a sample of likely voters? Well, again, you're going to use DFRDD. Then you get a subsample of people who are actually registered to vote. Then you ask a few more questions. Besides who are you going to vote for, you ask, do you intend to vote in the next election? It's probably not asked that simply, but basically that's what you're trying to find out. And they may also ask you, how many past presidential elections have you voted in, et cetera, et cetera. So they're trying to collect information because what they're going to do is they are going to apply to you a probability that you will actually vote. They're not going to tell you what the probability is because when the interviewer is asking these questions, the interviewer has no idea, and even if she or he did, you know, it wouldn't be mentioned. And then all these statistical models are used to sort of guess what this future population of voters is going to be. And as I said, this whole slide is sort of, I consider to be not strictly under the umbrella of sample survey methodology because the target population is not out there yet. So it uses a lot of input, data from sample survey polls, etc. But it's a lot of guessing going on. Hopefully educated guessing. Okay. And the polling, whoops, sorry. So the polling companies that do this, from what I read, it seems that they don't share their methodologies with other polling companies. It's sort of like if you're Coca-Cola, you're not going to share your recipe with the Pepsi company, all right? So they're trade secrets or whatever. And also, it's hard to find out exactly what they're doing with all of the statistical modeling, because, as they say, it's sort of a secret. Statewide. Now, if you're interested in statewide polls, you have the same 3 target populations of interest: all adults for opinion, registered voters, and then likely voters. But you're doing the sampling within a specific state. Whoops, sorry. Okay, so for state target populations that are household adults, where you're asking for opinion, typically DF-RDD is used on the state level. Registered voters, you typically get a sample of adults using DF, and then you ask them, are you registered? And likely voters, you're doing all of the statistical modeling, but on the state level. So it's very similar to what's done on the national level, except it's on the state level. So now, what went wrong in 2016? Okay, all right. So if you recall, the probability that Clinton, the stated probability for Clinton being elected to the presidency, I think ran from 99% to 71%. I don't know if anybody knows anything lower than that. The 71% was from Nate Silver, okay? So he was the most conservative in terms of the lowest probability. Now, Silver has this concept called herding. I don't know if this is a political science term or not, it might be, but you know, if lots of people are generating these probabilities, and you get a probability that's sort of out of line with what everybody else is getting, you might go back and look at your methodology again, maybe change a couple assumptions so that you're closer to the herd, okay? And Nate didn't do that. All the other people were in the 90s, and Nate is out here, 71%, you know. He's not afraid to leave the herd. Okay? But he says this is a tendency of people who are calculating these predicted probabilities that Clinton win, that Trump win, etc. Okay, and just remember, when you're trying to get down to these probabilities of a Clinton win, it goes way beyond basic polling data. I can't stress enough, there are a lot of assumptions, etc. Okay, now, so if these predictions are wrong, who is at fault? Is it the faulty poll data, or is it the faulty statistical modeling used by the prognosticators? So this is the AAPOR report, major conclusion. They found evidence for several factors that led the polls to understate support for Trump, especially in battleground statements. So that, if you had to sum up the whole report, that shortly, that's it. All right. So now I'm going to go over some of the more specific conclusions they had. So one thing they harped about, and Nate Silver is very big on this if you read his website, the uncertainty of these poll estimates is simply not communicated. It certainly is not communicated to the general public. It may not even be communicated to the journalists who are writing about the poll results. And there are things called data journalists. They're supposed to know more about data. But it's simply not there. Yes, Diane.
It was starting to rain,
Oh.
and someone who owns BMW, is there anybody here has the top down? It's not BMW. It's running along.
Would you please quantify that? A lot. Okay. All right. Okay. So, all right. So I think the general public just didn't have, most of the general public didn't really have an idea that things were as uncertain as they really were. You know, so I had a close friend who said, oh, you know, it looks like Hillary is going to win. You know, I hope, you know, she wins by, you know, 52 points or something. I don't even know if that's possible. But anyway, you know, Hillary, you know, 80% of the electoral votes, Trump, okay. And I just kept saying, I'm not so sure. Okay. So another conclusion they had was that the national polls, for the most part, were not too bad. They were generally correct and accurate. They compared it to the historical past. They weren't too far off. Generally, in the national polls, and remember, this is estimating the popular vote, all right? The popular vote, of course, doesn't elect the president, as we all know, right? But generally, you know, a lot of these polls showed that Clinton had a 3-point lead, okay? And in fact, when the votes were counted, she won the popular vote by 2.1 votes. Okay, so the national polls were sort of doing okay, all right. The state level polls are a different story. So the AAPOR report says that the state polls had lower quality, for their methodology, they had less rigor, they had a smaller sample size, which gives you even more uncertainty. Their weighting adjustments were less comprehensive. Most of them did not weight for education, for example, etc. And as a result of all of this, the Trump support was clearly underestimated, particularly in certain areas of the country, the upper Midwest being one case. So here's something that I hadn't remembered all these details, but Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin had voted Democrat in the last 6 elections, and the people doing the prognosticating, the forecasting into the future, they sort of expected that blue ball to hold, and it collapsed because Trump won all 3 states. Narrowly, but you know, if you win, you win. It doesn't matter if you win by 0.5%. Why did the state polls underestimate support for Trump? Okay, so here's one reason that the AAPOR report decided that they had strong evidence for. There was a real late change in the vote preference. Remember that the estimated 10% of people who weren't saying in polls for whom they were going to vote? A substantial share of voters actually disliked both candidates. Maybe that's why some people have a hard time deciding for whom to vote. And in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Florida, an estimated 11 to 15% of voters decided on their vote in the final week of the campaign. Now, how does the report know this? This comes from what's called exit poll data, all right? So exit polls, certain precincts are selected, interviewers stand outside the poll as people exit the poll and they say, who did you vote for? And then a couple other questions, like, when did you decide when your vote? Okay, so this is to me, just as an average citizen, sort of a high percentage of people deciding very late in the game. And of these late deciders, in these 4 particular states, in Wisconsin, the late deciders voted for Trump by 29 points. I mean, this is phenomenal, or an estimated 29 points. You know, like, so percent Trump minus percent Clinton is 29%, okay? And by 17-point spread in Florida and Pennsylvania, Trump over Clinton and 11. I mean, this is really pretty dramatic. Another reason I've already mentioned, that the state polls in particular, very few of them adjusted for education. So they didn't adjust for the overrepresentation of college plus people. I already talked about that. Here's a little graph, which I'm not going to talk about. Okay. Medium evidence for this reason, a change in turnout between 2012 and 2016. So this is where the prognosticators are coming into play. They're trying to guess what the turnout is going to be in the future, and they didn't guess very well. So for example, Republican and rural turnout was higher in 2016 in key states compared to 2012, and also lower 26 turnout among core Democratic voters compared to 2012, right? And you've probably read about some of this in the newspaper. this is another graph, which I will go over later if questions come up. Weaker evidence. The famous Comey FBI letter on October 28, which says that they're reopening the Clinton investigation about the emails or whatever. So that bombshell came out on October 28. Now, what the AAPOR committee did, they looked at a lot of polls that they had that were conducted between this time period, October 20, November 7. November 7 is the day before the election, November 8. All right. And October 20 is before the October 28 bombshell. And so what they were looking at over time, a lot of these were continuous polls that do moving averages over time, et cetera. So they were looking to see if right after or shortly after October 28, there was sort of a dip in the support for Clinton, all right? And their conclusion, and I looked at their graphs and blah, 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 and so I agree with them. There's mixed evidence at best of a Comey effect on the Clinton lead, all right? So that was the committee conclusion. And so currently, we don't really know why, say, especially in the upper Midwest, the late deciders broke for Trump. That question, I'm sure, will be answered with data because the exit poll data are in the process of being released now to researchers. The people in the committee got it early because they were, special people, or they were, working on this issue. So there's a lot there, and there are other polls that are being done where you have people who are interviewed before the election and then after the election. Those data sets are now sort of becoming available. So a lot of people will be analyzing this election probably for the next 20 years, right? Okay, now, regarding Comey, Nate Silver has a very different opinion about this. If you read his website, he thinks it's really, that this really had an effect. And not only that, the way I read what he says is that he says the media is in denial that this actually happened, that there was an effect of the Comey October 28. So again, Nate is not following the herd, at least the herd of the committee who wrote this report on this opinion. There was also something about the shy Trump effect, where you might call a person on the phone, they agree to participate, they know they're going to vote for Trump, but they're reluctant to tell a live person on the other end of it. And the committee did not, they found very weak evidence that this was actually happening. Okay. So here are the summary conclusions from the AAPOR report. Okay, so poll uncertainty, national polls okay, state polls not so great, Trump support underestimated for various reasons, and the possible effect of the Comey letter. Implications for future polls. I'm almost done. Okay. People will now adjust for education in the future, I can assure you. And as a matter of fact, you should, when you look at estimated approval rating for Trump's job as president, do you think education is going to be related to that? Yeah. Of course. So when you look at that and you read the methodology that they tell you about the poll, look and see if education is one of the factors that the data were adjusted for, along with age and gender and race, ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. It should be in there. Yes?
Is it possible retroactively to go back and adjust for education with some of those polls and see if your hypothesis is correct?
Yes. Can you go back and look at the polls and adjust for education and see what happens. The AAPOR committee did this for several polls, and they found out the support for Trump was higher. The support for Clinton was lower, yes. It certainly is possible to do that, and they did some of it. So AAPOR also says, look, if you're going to zero in on this point spread, you should